Welcome to World Class, a podcast where voices from across the world come together to explore theology with a focus on contextual theology. In every episode, you hear inspiring stories, profound insights, and fresh perspectives that reflect the rich diversity of our world. This podcast is about listening, learning, and living tuned into diverse voices, gaining wisdom and applying it to our lives. Together, we'll navigate the intersections of faith, culture, and lived experiences to deepen our understanding of how theology shapes and is shaped by the context we live in. And now, here is your host, Rodney Ragwan.
Welcome to World Class, a podcast where we explore global Christian lives that shape the church far beyond their borders, often quietly, often without recognition, but never without significance. Much of Christian mission history has been told through Western eyes. We are familiar with missionaries from Europe or North America to Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Their stories are important, and we thank God for the wonderful work that they've done over many, many decades. But they are not the whole story. Today, I want to tell you about a different kind of missionary, a man who did not come from the West, but from the global South, a man who crossed oceans not backed by empire, but by a fragile and faithful church. A man whose ministry unfolded not in revival headlines, but in patient, pastoral endurance. His name was Reverend David Newton Nathaniel. When I was in primary school and later in my early high school years in South Africa, I remember Reverend David Newton Nathaniel visiting my home church, Tinley Manor Baptist Church. He was striking in stature, and he carried a presence that filled the church long before he spoke. I loved listening to his sermons. Even as a young boy, I sensed the depth, gentleness, and authority in his preaching. Those moments left an imprint on me. Today, as I share this episode on this podcast about his life, I do so with deep humility. I feel genuinely honored that I was once in his presence, never realizing then how significant his ministry truly was, or how profoundly his legacy would shape my understanding of mission and leadership. In the early 1950s, Reverend David Nathaniel left South India. He left South India and traveled to South Africa to serve the Indian Baptist churches of Natal, now called KwaZulu-Natal. At a time when those churches were vulnerable, divided, and living under the tightening grip of apartheid. For nearly 35 years, Reverend Nathaniel shepherded congregations, taught scripture, wrote theology, raised a family, and quietly strengthened a community that history has largely overlooked. This episode is about his life, but it is also about a larger story, the story of South to South mission, the story of indigenous leadership. After the story of faithfulness when the spotlight never comes. I want to share a few areas of this very significant leader that came from India to South Africa. I want to firstly look at the roots in South India. And then I want to focus on a call across the ocean and ministry under apartheid, and then the scholar pastor. And then we'll move on to legacy and significance, and then a brief reflection. Let's look at his roots in South India. David Newton Nathaniel was born on October 24th, 1908 in South India, in the region of Ramapatnam, within a Telugu-speaking Christian context. Now this matters. Nathaniel did not come from a newly evangelized background. He was shaped within an indigenous Indian Christian tradition. A faith already negotiating questions of culture, caste, colonial power, and Christian identity. He was educated in mission schools and later trained at respected theological institutions, including Bangalore Theological College, which had connections to both Indian and British Baptist traditions. From early on, Nathaniel demonstrated a rare combination: a deep love for Scripture, a pastoral heart for ordinary believers, and a disciplined theological mind. He was ordained as a Baptist minister in India, already formed as a preacher, teacher, and shepherd long before any missionary called beyond his homeland. This is important to embrace. Reverend Nathaniel was not sent overseas to become a minister. He was sent because he already was one. He married Jayama, and together they began raising a family, anchored in faith, community, and the rhythms of church life in South India. And yet in the late 1940s, a call emerged that would take them away or take them far from everything familiar. Let's move on to a call across the ocean. To understand that call, we must briefly turn our attention to South Africa. The Indian Baptist churches in Natal owed much of their formation to earlier missionaries from India, like the founder, Reverend John Rangia, and then his son, Reverend Theophilus Rangia, who had been a towering figure in Indian Christian life and mission. Rangia's death in 1947 left a painful void. Without strong leadership, the Indian Baptist community in South Africa faced organizational fragility, the pressure of racial segregation, cultural marginalization, and growing uncertainty about its future. Church leaders recognized that what was needed was not simply administrative oversight, but pastoral and theological leadership. Their eyes turned towards India. After prayerful discernment, they extended an invitation to Reverend David Newton Nathaniel to serve as superintendent missionary to the Indian Baptist churches of Natal. This was no easy decision. Nathaniel faced resistance even before he left India. Some questioned his calling. Others doubted the wisdom of uprooting his family for an uncertain future in a racially divided land. Yet he discerned this call not as ambition, but as obedience. In 1951, Reverend Nathaniel, Jayama, and their children boarded a ship and traveled to South Africa, arriving in Natal at a moment of profound historical tension. Apartheid was not yet fully systematized, but its shadow was already long and dark. We move on now to ministry under apartheid. Reverend Nathaniel entered South Africa not as a visitor, but as a servant. He ministered primarily among Indian Baptist congregations, many of them Telugu-speaking, scattered and struggling to survive under racialized laws that limited movement, education, employment, and worship. His role as superintendent meant traveling extensively between congregations, providing pastoral care to ministers and families, teaching scripture, strengthening church governance, encouraging unity amid cultural and generational tensions. This was not glamorous work. There were no large platforms, no national recognition, no ease of ministry. In fact, Nathaniel faced criticism and resistance, sometimes from within the church itself. Leadership transitions are rarely smooth, and cultural expectations often collide. But those who knew him remembered him as steady, gentle, and deeply committed. He understood ministry not as control, but as care. And all of this took place within the daily realities of apartheid, where Indian communities were officially categorized, restricted, and marginalized. Reverend Nathaniel's ministry reminds us that theology is never abstract. It is lived out in homes, in congregations, and under unjust systems. He did not lead protests from the pulpit, but neither did he retreat into silence. Instead, he cultivated resilient Christian identity, grounding believers in scripture, prayer, and communal life. In doing so, he helped sustain faith under pressure. We move on now to the scholar pastor. One of the most remarkable aspects of Reverend Nathaniel's life was his lifelong commitment to learning. He was not content merely to manage churches. He believed deeply in theological education, especially for pastors serving marginalized communities. Over the years, he wrote numerous works, both devotional and theological, including biblical commentaries, pastoral guides, teaching materials for emerging preachers. His writing was marked by clarity, pastoral sensitivity, and deep engagement with Scripture. And then, remarkably, in his latter years, he returned formally to academic study. At the age of 70, Reverend Nathaniel earned a Master of Divinity degree from the University of Durban-Westville, now called the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Let that sink in. At a stage of life when many are slowing down, he was learning, still studying, still believing that the mind matters in the life of faith. He embodied what we might call the scholar pastor, someone who refused to separate theology from ministry or learning from service. Let's move on now to legacy and significance. Reverend David Nathaniel served in South Africa for nearly 35 years. He did not build an empire. He did not found a movement bearing his name. He did not seek prominence, and yet his legacy is profound. He helped stabilize a vulnerable church community. He nurtured indigenous leadership. He modeled faithfulness across cultures and continents. His life challenges how we tell mission history. So often we celebrate those who went from the West to the rest. Nathaniel's story reminds us that the gospel has long been carried from the margins to the margins. from India to Africa, from one oppressed community to another. He stands as a quiet witness to South mission, a reality that continues to shape global Christianity today. Reverend Nathaniel passed away on December 20th, 1985, at the age of 77. His name may not appear in many textbooks, but his faithfulness is written into the lives and churches he served. Here my closing reflection. As we consider Reverend Nathaniel's life, we are invited to see mission not as a one-way street, but as a web of grace that stretches across oceans and generations, carried by people whose strength is not celebrity, but steadfastness. First, his story teaches us that mission flourishes at the margins. Nathaniel was formed in an Indian Christian tradition that knew what it meant to wrestle with identity, between caste and baptismal belonging, between colonial structures and gospel freedom. When he crossed to South Africa, he did not arrive as a benefactor to the poor. He arrived as a brother among the burdened. This South-to-South movement is not an exception to mission history. It is part of its beating heart. It reminds us that the gospel is most often entrusted to those who understand suffering from the inside. Second, Nathaniel's ministry under apartheid reminds us that theology is public, even when it is pastoral. He may not have led rallies from the pulpit, but he practiced resistance of a different kind. He stabilized congregations, formed consciences, and knit communities together. Even Bible study that taught the Imago Dei. Every believer meeting that affirmed dignity. Every visit that bound up fear. Those were quiet acts of defiance against a system designed to fragment and dehumanize. In this sense, pastoral care becomes a form of public witness. It keeps hope alive, identity intact, and faith communal. Third, his late life pursuit of theological study proclaims that mission requires both devotion and depth. At 70, he chose the discipline of learning, not to climb a ladder, but to serve better in a world that often separates passion from preparation. He held them together. He dignified small churches with serious theology and dignified theology by putting it to work among small churches. This is the vocation of the scholar pastor, to bring clarity where there is confusion and consolation where there is pain. And then fourth, his life reframes how we measure impact. We tend to count crowds, cliques, and conferences. Nathaniel's legacy counts people, pastors steadied, families shepherded, young preachers trained, congregations held together through storms. He shows us that the metrics of the kingdom are measured in durability, not visibility, faithfulness, not fame. Finally, Nathaniel's journey invites us to practice mutuality in mission, not from the strong to the weak, but from grace to need, and often from one wounded healer to another. The same Spirit who sent a minister from Ramapatnam to Natal still sends us across cultural lines today, sometimes across oceans, sometimes just across the street, to bear witness with humility, to learn as we serve and serve as we learn. So what might we take from his story? To leaders, stay. Your steady presence may be the moral radical gift you can offer. To students and elders alike, keep learning. Depth is not a luxury, it's a ministry. To churches at the margins, your story is not peripheral to God's mission. It is essential to it. To those weary of obscurity, God sees. History may forget, but heaven remembers. Reverend David Newton Nathaniel never built an empire, but he built endurance. He did not craft a brand, but he formed a people. And in the economy of God's kingdom, that is how the world is changed. Slowly, faithfully, from the inside out. May his life reorient our imagination from center to margin, from speed to patience, from platform to presence, from heroism to holy endurance. May we be found faithful in our time as he was in his. God bless. If you've enjoyed this world-class episode, I invite you to partner with me in sharing stories that equip leaders and inspire global mission. As a global servant with international ministries, your monthly, quarterly, or annual gifts help make these conversations possible and support training for emerging Christian leaders around the world. You can give by visiting www.internationalministries.org/Rodney-Ragwan, and you can also find the link in the podcast description. Thank you for listening, praying, and partnering in God's mission. God bless you.